In the winter of 1846, nearly 90 pioneers were trapped in the Sierra Nevada mountains, and some would do the unthinkable to survive. Their story is one of hope, hardship, and the limits of human endurance. Today, we journey back to the American frontier, to a time when the promise of a new life could turn in a matter of weeks into a struggle for existence. This is the story of the Donner Party. Let us know which country or state you're listening from. We love to know where history still echoes. The story of the Donner Party begins not in the snowbound passes of the Sierra Nevada, but in the bustling towns and farmlands of the American Midwest. In the spring of 1846, the United States was in the grip of westward expansion. The Oregon Trail, stretching over 2,000 miles from Missouri to the Pacific coast, beckoned thousands with the promise of fertile land and a new beginning. Among those drawn by this promise were the families of George Donner and James F. Reed. George Donner, a 62-year-old farmer from Illinois, was respected and prosperous. James Reed, an Irish immigrant and businessman, was ambitious and eager for opportunity. Together they gathered their families, friends, and neighbors, a group of men, women, and children, some related by blood, others by hope. Their destination: California, a land rumored to be rich and welcoming, where fortunes could be made and futures secured. The group set out from Springfield, Illinois in April 1846. Spirits were high. The wagons were loaded with supplies, livestock, and the tools of a new life. The journey ahead was daunting, but the travelers were determined. They joined the main body of emigrants at Independence, Missouri, the traditional starting point of the Oregon Trail. Here they became part of a great migration, a river of humanity flowing westward, each wagon a vessel of dreams. For months the Donner Party followed the well-worn ruts of the Oregon Trail. They crossed the rolling prairies of Kansas, forded rivers, and endured the heat and dust of the plains. Progress was steady, but the journey was not without hardship. Wagons broke down, oxen strayed, and tempers sometimes flared. Yet, these were the expected trials of the trail, endured by thousands before them. It was in early July, near Fort Laramie in present-day Wyoming, that the Donner Party faced a decision that would change everything. At the fort, they encountered a new guidebook, written by Lansford W. Hastings, a young lawyer and adventurer. Hastings claimed to have discovered a shortcut, the Hastings Cutoff, that would shave hundreds of miles off the journey to California. The route, he promised, would bypass the long northern arc of the established trail, cutting directly through the Wasatch Mountains and across the Great Salt Lake Desert. The shortcut was tempting. The Donner Party, already behind schedule, saw in it a chance to make up lost time. But there were warnings. Experienced travelers and mountain men at Fort Laramie cautioned against the untested route. Hastings himself had never led a large wagon train over it. The shortcut, they said, was risky. The terrain unknown, the water scarce, the mountains steep. Despite these warnings, the Donner Party chose to take the Hastings Cutoff. The decision was not made lightly. Some members argued for the established trail, but the promise of a quicker passage, combined with the pressure of the approaching winter, swayed the group. They left the main trail at Fort Bridger, a small trading post in southwestern Wyoming, and struck out into the unknown. Almost immediately, the difficulties began. The Wasatch Mountains proved far more rugged than Hastings had described. The wagons had to be disassembled and hauled up steep, rocky slopes. Progress slowed to a crawl. Days stretched into weeks. Supplies dwindled. The party lost precious time, nearly a month, hacking a path through dense forests and tangled undergrowth. When they finally emerged from the mountains, the worst was yet to come. Ahead lay the Great Salt Lake Desert, a barren expanse of salt flats and shimmering heat. Hastings had claimed the desert crossing would take 2 days. In reality, it took the Donner Party nearly a week. Water was almost non-existent. Oxen collapsed from thirst and exhaustion. Wagons were abandoned. The party's unity began to fray under the strain. By the time the Donner Party rejoined the main California Trail near the Humboldt River, they had lost not only time and supplies, but also trust in their leaders and in each other. The shortcut had cost them dearly. It was now late September. The Sierra Nevada, the final barrier to California, loomed ahead. The first snows could come at any time. Still, the party pressed on. They were exhausted, but the promise of California was now tantalizingly close. They followed the Humboldt River westward, but the hardships continued. The river's water was alkaline and bitter. Grass for the animals was scarce. Tensions flared between families. Arguments broke out over food, leadership, and blame for their predicament. In late October, the party reached Truckee Lake, now known as Donner Lake, at the foot of the Sierra Nevada. The mountains rose before them, steep and forbidding. The weather was turning. Some members urged a quick push over the pass before the snows came. Others, weakened and discouraged, hesitated. On October 28, 1846, the first heavy snowstorm swept over the mountains, blocking the pass and trapping the Donner Party in the High Sierra. Their journey, which had begun with such hope and determination, was now a desperate struggle for survival. In the coming months, the choices they would face would test the limits of human endurance and morality. The story of the Donner Party was about to enter its darkest chapter. As October 1846 drew to a close, the Donner Party found themselves at the edge of the Sierra Nevada, battered by exhaustion and dwindling supplies. The first snowstorm, which began on October 28th, was relentless. Heavy, wet snow fell for days, blanketing the landscape and quickly making the mountain pass impassable. The wagons, already battered from the journey, became immobilized. The oxen, their last hope for mobility, struggled to find forage beneath the deepening snow. The party was forced to make camp at Truckee Lake, a small, icy body of water surrounded by dense forest and steep slopes. Some families, including the Donners themselves, were stranded a few miles behind at Alder Creek, separated from the main group by the storm. The snowdrifts in places reached 5 feet deep. The world outside their makeshift shelters became a frozen prison. The pioneers constructed crude cabins and lean-tos from logs and canvas, huddling together for warmth. The Reed, Graves, Breen, Murphy, and Kesseberg families clustered near the lake, while the Donners, delayed by a broken wagon axle and George Donner's injured hand, remained isolated at Alder Creek. The separation would have profound consequences in the weeks to come. As the days passed, the reality of their predicament set in. The food supplies, already depleted by the delays of the Hastings cutoff and the desert crossing, were dangerously low. The party had expected to reach California weeks earlier, where fresh provisions awaited. Now, with the pass blocked and no way forward, they faced the prospect of a long, uncertain winter. The psychological strain was immediate and intense. The adults tried to shield the children from the worst of their fears, but the anxiety was palpable. Each day the snow deepened, and the hope of rescue seemed to recede. The pioneers rationed their remaining food: flour, beans, bacon, and a little dried meat. They boiled hides and bones to make thin, bitter soup. The oxen and horses, once their means of travel, became their last source of sustenance. One by one, the animals were slaughtered and consumed. The group's leaders, including James Reed and William Eddy, recognized the urgency of their situation. They debated their options: wait for rescue or attempt to cross the mountains on foot. The decision was complicated by the presence of so many children and elderly members. The snow was deep, the terrain treacherous, and the risk of becoming lost or succumbing to exposure was high. In early November, a small group attempted to break through the pass. They found the snow too deep and were forced to return. The party's morale suffered another blow. The prospect of waiting out the winter became increasingly grim. The cabins, though offering some shelter, were cold and damp. Smoke from the fires filled the cramped spaces, irritating eyes and lungs. Illness began to spread, further weakening the group. As November turned to December, the psychological toll deepened. The pioneers faced not only physical hunger but also the gnawing fear of abandonment. They had left letters and messages along the trail, hoping that passing emigrants or rescue parties would find them. But as the snow continued to fall, the outside world seemed impossibly distant. The group's social fabric began to fray. Tensions, already present from the hardships of the trail, intensified under the pressure of survival. Arguments broke out over food distribution and leadership. Some accused others of hoarding supplies or shirking responsibilities. The stress of confinement, hunger, and uncertainty tested even the closest relationships. Yet amid the hardship, there were moments of resilience and cooperation. The families shared what little they had. They took turns caring for the sick and comforting the children. They told stories and sang songs to keep spirits up. The will to survive, though battered, endured. By mid-December, it was clear that waiting for rescue was no longer an option. The snow showed no sign of melting, and the food was nearly gone. A decision was made. A group of the strongest men and women would attempt to cross the mountains on foot and seek help. This group would become known as the Forlorn Hope. On December 16, 1846, 17 members of the party, 10 men and 7 women, set out from Truckee Lake, equipped with makeshift snowshoes and what little food they could carry. Their plan was simple, but desperate: to reach Sutter's Fort, more than 80 miles away, and bring back help. The rest of the party, including the children and the weakest members, remained behind, clinging to the hope that the Forlorn Hope would succeed. The departure of the Forlorn Hope marked a turning point. For those who remained, the sense of isolation deepened. The days were marked by monotony and hunger, the nights by cold and fear. The snowstorms continued, sometimes lasting for days. The cabins became tomb-like, the air thick with despair. At Alder Creek, the Donner families faced even greater hardship. Their shelter was less substantial and their supplies even more limited. George Donner's hand, injured while repairing a wagon, became infected. Tamsin Donner, his wife, struggled to care for him and their children, rationing every scrap of food. Throughout December, the party's physical condition deteriorated. Malnutrition set in, weakening immune systems and sapping strength. The children, especially, suffered. Their cries of hunger haunted the adults who were powerless to provide more than meager scraps. The psychological effects of starvation began to manifest. Some members became withdrawn, others irritable or despondent. The boundaries between hope and despair blurred. The pioneers clung to routines, tending fires, melting snow for water, telling stories, as a way to maintain a sense of normalcy in an increasingly abnormal world. Meanwhile, the Forlorn Hope struggled through the mountains facing their own ordeal. Their fate would soon become intertwined with the survival of those left behind. As the year 1846 ended, the Donner Party was trapped in a frozen wilderness, their fate uncertain. The decisions they would make in the coming weeks would test the limits of human endurance and morality, and would echo through history as a cautionary tale of hope, hardship, and the will to survive. As December 1846 gave way to the new year, the Donner Party's struggle for survival entered its most desperate phase. The group known as the Forlorn Hope had set out from Truckee Lake, determined to cross the snowbound Sierra Nevada and bring back help. Their departure was a moment of both hope and dread for those left behind. The families watched as their loved ones disappeared into the white wilderness, uncertain if they would ever return. The Forlorn Hope consisted of 17 people, 10 men and 7 women, including Mary Graves, Sarah Fosdick, and William Eddy. They carried only what they could manage: scraps of food, makeshift snowshoes, and the faint hope that they could reach civilization. The snow was deep, the cold unrelenting, and the terrain unforgiving. Each step was a test of endurance. Within days, the group's food ran out. They had expected to find game or perhaps reach a lower elevation quickly, but the mountains offered little. Hunger gnawed at their bodies and minds. The physical effects of starvation set in: weakness, dizziness, and confusion. The psychological effects were just as severe. The group's unity began to fray as exhaustion and fear took hold. As the Forlorn Hope pressed on, they faced a series of harrowing decisions. When one member, Charles Stanton, became too weak to continue, he urged the others to go on without him. He sat down in the snow and was never seen again. The group's progress slowed as more members faltered. The snowshoes, hastily constructed from oxbows and rawhide, began to fail. On the sixth day, the group realized that survival would require a choice that few could have imagined when they set out from Illinois months earlier. With no food and no hope of rescue, they faced the ultimate moral dilemma: whether to consume the bodies of those who had died. According to survivor accounts, the decision was not made lightly. The group debated, prayed, and wept. In the end, the will to survive overcame the taboo. They used the bodies of the dead to sustain the living. Back at Truckee Lake and Alder Creek, the rest of the Donner Party endured their own ordeal. The snow continued to fall and the food supplies dwindled to almost nothing. The families boiled hides, chewed on leather, and scraped the last bits of marrow from bones. The psychological strain was immense. Parents watched their children grow weaker by the day. The sense of isolation was profound. The group's social dynamics shifted under the pressure. Some families drew closer, sharing what little they had. Others became more guarded, suspicious that their neighbors might be hiding food. Arguments flared over the distribution of supplies and the fairness of decisions. The leadership of the group was questioned and old grievances resurfaced. The physical effects of starvation became more pronounced. The children, in particular, suffered from malnutrition. Their bodies became thin and frail, their energy sapped. The adults, too, grew weaker. Simple tasks became exhausting. Illness spread through the cramped, smoke-filled cabins. The psychological effects of hunger, irritability, depression, and apathy were evident in every interaction. At Alder Creek, the Donners faced even greater hardship. Their shelter was less substantial, and their supplies were nearly gone. George Donner's hand, infected and swollen, left him unable to help his family. Tamsin Donner struggled to care for her husband and children, rationing every scrap of food. The isolation of Alder Creek added to their despair. As the days passed, the boundaries between hope and despair blurred. Some members clung to the belief that rescue would come. Others began to lose faith. The monotony of the days, tending fires, melting snow for water, comforting the children, became a way to maintain a sense of normalcy in an increasingly abnormal world. Meanwhile, the Forlorn Hope continued their journey. After more than 2 weeks in the mountains, only 7 of the original 17 remained alive. They had endured unimaginable hardship, starvation, exposure, and the psychological toll of their choices. On January 17, 1847, the survivors stumbled into a Native American village near the western foothills of the Sierra Nevada. The villagers, members of the Miwok and Maidu tribes, provided food and shelter, saving their lives. Word of the stranded emigrants quickly spread. The survivors of the Forlorn Hope were taken to Sutter's Fort, where they told their story. The news shocked the small community of settlers in California. Plans were immediately made to organize rescue parties. Back at Truckee Lake and Alder Creek, the Donner Party remained unaware that help was finally on the way. The psychological state of the group continued to deteriorate. The deaths of friends and family members weighed heavily on the survivors. Some recorded their experiences in diaries, leaving behind a record of their suffering and resilience. One such account came from Patrick Breen, who kept a diary throughout the ordeal. His entries, terse and matter-of-fact, provide a window into the daily reality of the camp. Snowed all night with a strong wind. The snow drifted badly. The people are very weak. Some are dying. Breen's words capture the monotony and despair of life in the cabins, as well as the faint hope that rescue might still come. The psychological impact of the ordeal was profound. The survivors were haunted by the choices they had made and the losses they had endured. The bonds of family and friendship were tested to their limits. Some found strength in their faith, others in the determination to see their loved ones survive. As January turned to February, the Donner Party's situation grew even more desperate. The food was gone, and the survivors faced the same moral dilemma as the Forlorn Hope. The decision to consume the bodies of the dead was made out of necessity, not desire. The survivors later described the act as one of last resort, undertaken only when all other options had been exhausted. The story of the Donner Party is not just one of physical survival, but of psychological endurance. The choices they faced, who would eat, who would be eaten, who would lead, and who would follow, were shaped by the extreme conditions of their environment. The legacy of those choices would echo through history, raising questions about the limits of human endurance and the moral boundaries of survival. As the first rescue party prepared to set out from Sutter's Fort, the fate of the Donner Party hung in the balance. The coming weeks would bring both relief and further tragedy, as the survivors confronted the final tests of their ordeal. In early February 1847, the first rescue party set out from Sutter's Fort, spurred by the harrowing accounts of the Forlorn Hope survivors. The news of the stranded emigrants trapped by snow and starvation high in the Sierra Nevada galvanized the small but growing community of California settlers. Volunteers gathered supplies, flour, dried meat, blankets, and prepared to face the same treacherous mountains that had nearly claimed the lives of the Forlorn Hope. The rescue party, led by Daniel Rhodes and including men like John Stark and James Reed, who had been banished from the Donner Party months earlier after a violent altercation, fought their way through deep snowdrifts and freezing temperatures. The journey was slow and perilous. The rescuers themselves faced hunger and exhaustion, but the thought of families, especially children, waiting in the mountains drove them onward. On February 19, 1847, after weeks of struggle, the first rescuers reached the camps at Truckee Lake. What they found was a scene of profound suffering. The survivors, gaunt and hollow-eyed, emerged from their cabins and shelters, barely able to stand. The rescuers were shocked by the conditions. The snow was still deep, the cabins half buried, and the air heavy with the smell of smoke and sickness. The psychological state of the survivors was fragile. Many had lost hope of rescue. Some wept openly at the sight of the rescuers. Others were too weak to react. The children in particular were in dire condition, malnourished, listless, and frightened. The adults too showed the effects of months of starvation and isolation. Their faces were drawn, their movements slow and deliberate, every action an effort. The rescuers quickly assessed the situation. There was not enough food to feed everyone, nor enough strength among the survivors to make the journey out all at once. The rescue party distributed what supplies they had, but it was clear that only the strongest could attempt the trek back to safety. The rest would have to wait for additional rescue parties. This decision, who would go and who would stay, was agonizing. Parents faced the impossible choice of sending their children with strangers, hoping they would survive the journey, or keeping them behind, risking that help might not return in time. Some families were separated with siblings and parents torn apart by the demands of survival. The first group to leave included the weakest children and those adults who still had the strength to walk. The journey out was as perilous as the journey in. The snow was deep, the cold unrelenting, and the food scarce. Some of the children, too weak to walk, were carried by the rescuers. Others had to be left behind when they could go no further. The psychological toll on both rescuers and rescued was immense. Every step was a test of endurance and willpower. Back at the camps, those who remained faced renewed despair. The brief hope brought by the rescuers faded as the reality of their situation set in. The food left behind was quickly consumed, and the survivors once again faced starvation. The psychological strain deepened. Some became despondent, others angry or withdrawn. The bonds of family and friendship were tested as never before. At Alder Creek, the Donner's situation was even more dire. George Donner's infection had worsened, leaving him bedridden. Tamsin Donner, torn between caring for her husband and trying to save her children, faced an impossible dilemma. The isolation of Alder Creek, combined with the lack of supplies, made survival even more precarious. The rescuers, upon returning to Sutter's Fort, immediately began organizing additional relief parties. The news of the Donner Party's plight spread throughout California, prompting more volunteers to brave the mountains. Each rescue party faced the same challenges: deep snow, freezing temperatures, and the ever-present risk of avalanches and exhaustion. The second relief party arrived at Truckee Lake in early March. By this time, the survivors' condition had deteriorated further. Some had died in the weeks since the first rescue. Others were barely clinging to life. The rescuers found evidence of the extreme measures the survivors had taken to stay alive. The psychological impact on the rescuers was profound. Many struggled to comprehend the suffering they witnessed. The process of evacuation was slow and painful. Each trip out of the mountains required careful planning and immense physical effort. The rescuers had to balance the need to move quickly with the reality that many survivors were too weak to travel. Some children were carried for miles through the snow. Others had to be left behind, with the promise that help would return. The survivors faced a new kind of psychological challenge: the guilt and grief of leaving loved ones behind, and the uncertainty of whether they would ever be reunited. The rescuers, too, bore a heavy burden. They were hailed as heroes, but many were haunted by the memories of what they had seen, and the knowledge that not everyone could be saved. As March turned to April, the final rescue parties made their way into the mountains. By now, the snow was beginning to melt, but the journey was still treacherous. The last survivors were found in a state of extreme starvation and psychological distress. Some, like Tamsin Donner, chose to stay with dying loved ones rather than save themselves. Others, too weak to move, died before help could reach them. Throughout the rescue efforts, the psychological and moral dilemmas faced by both survivors and rescuers were immense. The choices made in those mountains, who to save, who to leave, how to survive, would haunt those involved for the rest of their lives. The experience left deep scars, both physical and emotional. The story of the Donner Party is not just one of physical endurance, but of the psychological cost of survival. The decisions made under extreme duress, whether to consume the dead, whether to leave loved ones behind, whether to hope or despair, reveal the complexity of human nature in the face of unimaginable hardship. As the last survivors were brought out of the mountains, the full story of the Donner Party began to emerge. The public would soon learn of the suffering, the loss, and the extraordinary measures taken to survive. The legacy of those choices would shape the way the Donner Party was remembered, and would raise enduring questions about the limits of human endurance and the moral boundaries of survival. As the last survivors of the Donner Party were led out of the Sierra Nevada in the spring of 1847, the ordeal was far from over. The physical journey had ended, but the psychological and emotional consequences were only beginning to unfold. For those who survived, the return to civilization brought relief, but also a new set of challenges: grief, guilt, and the burden of memory. The survivors were taken to Sutter's Fort and nearby settlements, where they received food, shelter, and medical care. Many were unrecognizable to those who greeted them. Their bodies were emaciated, their faces gaunt, and their eyes haunted by what they had endured. The children, in particular, bore the marks of starvation and trauma. Some would never fully recover. The process of physical recovery was slow. The effects of prolonged starvation, muscle wasting, weakened immune systems, and lingering illness persisted for months. But the psychological wounds ran deeper. Survivors struggled with nightmares, flashbacks, and overwhelming grief for the family and friends they had lost. The bonds that had held the group together on the trail were now marked by absence and loss. The social dynamics among the survivors were complex. Some families had been decimated, with only a few members left. Others had lost parents, siblings, or children. The shared experience of suffering created a bond, but it also brought tension. Questions lingered about the choices made in the mountains, who had survived, and at what cost. The issue of cannibalism, once a desperate act of survival, now became a source of shame and stigma. Survivors were reluctant to speak openly about what had happened. Some denied it entirely. Others offered only vague or euphemistic accounts. The rescuers, too, were affected. Many struggled to reconcile the suffering they had witnessed with their own sense of morality and humanity. Conflicting accounts began to emerge almost immediately. Some survivors insisted that cannibalism had been a last resort, undertaken only after all other food sources were exhausted. Others suggested that not everyone had waited until the dead had passed naturally. Rumors circulated that some may have hastened the deaths of others, though no definitive evidence has ever been found to support these claims. Historians have debated these questions for generations. The written accounts left by survivors, diaries, letters, and later interviews offer a range of perspectives. Patrick Breen's diary, for example, is terse and factual, rarely delving into the emotional or moral dimensions of the ordeal. Other accounts, such as those of William Eddy and Mary Graves, are more detailed, describing the psychological torment of the choices they faced. The emotional toll on the survivors was immense. Many struggled with feelings of guilt and shame, not only for what they had done to survive, but for the loved ones they had been unable to save. Some survivors, like Virginia Reed, found solace in faith, interpreting their survival as a sign of divine providence. Others, like Louis Kesselberg, became the focus of suspicion and blame, accused by some of having taken more than his share or of acting with cruelty. The public reaction to the Donner Party's ordeal was immediate and intense. Newspapers across the United States published sensational accounts of the tragedy, often focusing on the most lurid details. The survivors became the subject of both sympathy and scandal. Some were hailed as heroes, others were shunned or ridiculed. The story of the Donner Party quickly became a cautionary tale, a symbol of both the dangers of westward expansion and the limits of human endurance. For the survivors, the return to normal life was difficult. Many struggled to find work or rebuild their lives. Some moved away from California, seeking anonymity and a fresh start. Others remained, determined to make something of the new life they had risked so much to reach. The psychological scars, however, remained. Survivors reported nightmares, anxiety, and a persistent sense of unease. The trauma of the mountains lingered long after the snow had melted. The children in particular faced unique challenges. Many had lost one or both parents. Some were taken in by relatives or adopted by other families. The experience of starvation and loss left a lasting mark, shaping their personalities and relationships for years to come. Some, like Patty Reed, would later speak publicly about their experiences, hoping to find meaning in the suffering they had endured. The rescuers, too, were changed by what they had witnessed. Many struggled with guilt over those they had been unable to save. Some were haunted by memories of the camps, the starving children, and the desperate choices made by the survivors. The experience left a deep impression on the small community of California settlers, shaping attitudes toward future emigrants and the challenges of westward expansion. The story of the Donner Party also raised important questions about leadership, decision-making, and the psychology of survival. Historians and psychologists have studied the group's dynamics, seeking to understand how individuals and families responded to extreme stress. The decisions made by the group, whether to take the Hastings cutoff, how to ration food, when to attempt escape, were shaped by a complex interplay of hope, fear, and necessity. The moral dilemmas faced by the survivors, whether to consume the dead, how to distribute food, who to save, reveal the complexity of human nature under duress. Some survivors later described the experience as a test of character, a crucible that revealed both the best and worst in themselves and others. The story of the Donner Party is a reminder that survival is not just a matter of physical endurance, but of psychological resilience and moral choice. As the years passed, the survivors of the Donner Party tried to move on with their lives. Some found peace in family and faith. Others struggled with the weight of memory. The story of their ordeal became part of American folklore, a symbol of both the promise and peril of the frontier. The questions raised by their experience about leadership, morality, and the limits of human endurance continue to resonate today. The legacy of the Donner Party is not just a story of tragedy, but of resilience and the enduring human spirit. The choices made in the mountains, though shaped by desperation, reveal the capacity for hope, cooperation, and sacrifice even in the darkest of times. The survivors, though marked by suffering, also demonstrated extraordinary courage and determination. As historians continue to study the Donner Party, new insights emerge about the psychology of survival, the dynamics of group decision-making, and the moral boundaries of human behavior. The story remains a powerful reminder of the challenges faced by those who sought a new life in the American West, and of the enduring questions about what it means to survive. In the months and years following the rescue, the story of the Donner Party became a subject of fascination, debate, and, for the survivors, a lifelong burden. As the survivors began to share their experiences, sometimes willingly, sometimes under pressure from journalists and the public, the world learned not only of their physical ordeal, but of the psychological and moral challenges they had faced. Testimonies from survivors and rescuers form the backbone of our understanding of what happened in those snowbound camps. Yet, as with any traumatic event, memories were shaped by fear, hunger, and the passage of time. Some accounts were detailed and vivid, others were fragmented or contradictory. The truth of the Donner Party's experience is found not in a single narrative, but in the mosaic of voices that emerged. Patrick Breen's diary remains one of the most important primary sources. Written in terse, daily entries, it documents the relentless snow, the dwindling food, and the deaths that marked each passing week. Breen rarely commented on the emotional or moral dimensions of their ordeal, but his words convey the monotony and despair of life in the cabins. Mrs. Murphy said here yesterday that she thought she would commence on Milt and eat him. I don't think she has done so yet. It is distressing. Such entries, understated yet haunting, offer a glimpse into the psychological toll of starvation and isolation. Other survivors, like Virginia Reed, later wrote letters and memoirs that provided more personal reflections. Virginia, just 13 years old during the ordeal, described the fear and confusion she felt as her family faced starvation. In a letter to her cousin, she wrote, "Oh Mary, I have not wrote you half the trouble we have had, but I have wrote enough to let you know what trouble is." Virginia's later life was marked by a determination to find meaning in her suffering, and she became one of the most vocal advocates for the survivors' dignity. William Eddy, one of the Forlorn Hope, gave detailed interviews about the journey out of the mountains. He described the moment when the group realized that survival would require the unthinkable. "We sat down and talked about it. We all agreed that it was the only way to save our lives." Eddy's testimony, like those of others, emphasized that cannibalism was a last resort, undertaken only after every other option had been exhausted. Yet not all accounts agreed. Some survivors, such as Louis Keseberg, became the focus of suspicion and controversy. Keseberg was the last adult rescued from the mountains, and rumors swirled that he had hastened the deaths of others or taken more than his share of food. Keseberg himself denied these accusations, insisting that he had done only what was necessary to survive. In later interviews, he spoke bitterly of the stigma he faced. "They call me a cannibal, but they do not know what it is to starve." The rescuers, too, left their own records. Daniel Rhodes, a member of the First Relief Party, described the shock of finding the survivors. They were gaunt, their eyes wild, their voices weak. Some could not speak at all. The children clung to us, afraid to let go. The rescuers' testimonies reveal not only the physical state of the survivors, but the psychological trauma that lingered long after the snow had melted. Conflicting historical records have fueled debate among historians. Some accounts suggest that not all cannibalism was strictly survival-based. There were whispers, never conclusively proven, that some deaths may have been hastened, or that the distribution of food was not always equitable. The lack of clear evidence, combined with the trauma of the event, makes it difficult to separate fact from rumor. What is clear, however, is the profound psychological impact of the ordeal. Survivors described feelings of guilt, shame, and grief that persisted for years. Some, like Mary Graves, struggled to speak of what had happened, even to close family members. Others, like Patty Reed, found solace in sharing their story, hoping to honor the memory of those who had died. The ethical dilemmas faced by the Donner Party have become a subject of study in psychology and philosophy. The concept of survival cannibalism, the consumption of the dead as a last resort, raises difficult questions about morality under extreme conditions. For the survivors, these were not abstract debates, but lived realities. The decision to eat the dead was made in the context of starvation, cold, and the knowledge that rescue might never come. The group's decision-making processes have also been analyzed. The initial choice to take the Hastings cutoff, the attempts to send for help, the rationing of food, and the allocation of resources all reflected the pressures of the environment and the limitations of human foresight. In the mountains, leadership was both essential and contested. Disagreements over strategy, blame for past decisions, and the stress of daily survival all contributed to the breakdown of group cohesion. Yet even in the darkest moments, there were acts of compassion and sacrifice. Some survivors gave up their food for children or the sick. Others risked their lives to search for help or to care for the dying. These moments of humanity, recorded in diaries and testimonies, remind us that the Donner Party's story is not only one of desperation, but also of resilience and solidarity. The legacy of the Donner Party is shaped by these conflicting narratives. For some, the story is a cautionary tale about the dangers of poor planning and the unpredictability of nature. For others, it is a testament to the strength of the human spirit in the face of overwhelming odds. The survivors' testimonies, with all their contradictions and complexities, offer a window into the psychological landscape of survival. As the years passed, the survivors carried their memories with them. Some found ways to integrate the experience into their lives, building families and communities in California and beyond. Others struggled with the weight of what they had endured. The story of the Donner Party became part of American folklore, retold in books, lectures, and eventually, film and television. Yet, beneath the layers of myth and interpretation, the voices of the survivors remain. Their testimonies, preserved in diaries, letters, and interviews, speak to the enduring questions raised by their ordeal. How do we make decisions under extreme duress? What are the limits of human endurance? And how do we live with the choices we make when survival is at stake? The answers are as complex and varied as the individuals who lived through that winter in the Sierra Nevada. Their story, shaped by memory and testimony, continues to challenge and inspire us, reminding us of both the fragility and the resilience of the human spirit. As the last snows of spring melted from the Sierra Nevada, the ordeal of the Donner Party finally drew to a close. The final rescue party, led by William Fallon, arrived at the camps in mid-April 1847. What they found was a scene of profound desolation. Only a handful of survivors remained, and the evidence of what had transpired was unmistakable. The cabins were silent, the makeshift shelters at Alder Creek abandoned, and the landscape bore the scars of a winter spent on the edge of existence. The final tally was grim. Of the nearly 90 men, women, and children who had set out for California, only 48 survived. The rest had perished from starvation, exposure, or illness. The survivors were a cross-section of the original party: children who had lost parents, parents who had lost children, and individuals who had endured the unthinkable. Their physical recovery would take months, but the psychological wounds would last a lifetime. The rescuers, too, were changed by what they witnessed. William Fallon, upon returning to Sutter's Fort, described the scene with a mixture of horror and compassion. He reported that the survivors were reduced to skeletons, their minds wandering, their bodies wasted. The rescuers buried the dead and did what they could to bring the last survivors to safety, but the memory of what they had seen would haunt them for years. For the survivors, the return to society was both a relief and a new challenge. Many were greeted with sympathy and support, but others faced suspicion and even hostility. The rumors of cannibalism, already circulating in California, were confirmed by the rescuers' reports. Newspapers across the country seized on the story, often exaggerating or sensationalizing the details. The survivors became unwilling celebrities, their private suffering transformed into public spectacle. The psychological impact of the ordeal was profound. Many survivors struggled with what we now recognize as post-traumatic stress, nightmares, flashbacks, and a persistent sense of anxiety. Some, like Patty Reed, found comfort in family and faith, using their experience to advocate for compassion and understanding. Others, like Louis Kesselberg, became isolated and embittered, unable to escape the shadow of public judgment. Kesselberg's story, in particular, illustrates the complexity of survival psychology. Accused by some of murder and theft, he spent years defending his actions. In interviews, he insisted that he had done only what was necessary to survive, and that he had been unfairly singled out. The stigma he faced was a reminder of how society grapples with the moral ambiguities of survival. For Kesselberg and others, the ordeal did not end with rescue. It continued in the form of public scrutiny and personal guilt. The children who survived the Donner Party faced their own challenges. Many were orphaned, taken in by relatives, or adopted by other families. Their memories of the mountains were often fragmented, shaped by both trauma and the stories told by adults. Some, like Virginia Reed, grew up to become advocates for the survivors, sharing their experiences in the hope of finding meaning and understanding. Others remained silent, choosing to leave the past behind. The public reaction to the Donner Party tragedy was complex. On one hand, there was sympathy for the suffering endured by the emigrants. On the other, there was a fascination with the details of cannibalism and survival. The story became a cautionary tale, used to warn future emigrants about the dangers of poor planning and the unpredictability of the wilderness. It also became a subject of moral debate. What would any of us do in the same situation? Where is the line between necessity and transgression? Historians and psychologists have continued to study the Donner Party as a case study in survival, decision-making, and group dynamics. The choices made by the party, whether to take the Hastings cutoff, how to ration food, when to attempt escape, have been analyzed for their psychological and ethical implications. The breakdown of group cohesion, the emergence of conflict, and the eventual resort to cannibalism all reflect the pressures of extreme deprivation and isolation. Survivor testimonies reveal the emotional toll of these decisions. Mary Graves, who lost most of her family, later wrote, "I often wonder why I was spared when so many others perished. The memory of that winter will never leave me." Her words echo the survivor's guilt felt by many who lived through the ordeal. The act of survival, while a testament to human resilience, also carried a heavy burden. The conflicting historical records have fueled ongoing debate. Some accounts suggest that not all acts of cannibalism were strictly survival-based, and that the distribution of food and resources was not always equitable. The lack of clear evidence, combined with the trauma of the event, makes it difficult to separate fact from rumor. What is certain is that the survivors faced impossible choices, and that their actions were shaped by the extreme conditions they endured. The legacy of the Donner Party is not just a story of tragedy, but of endurance and the complexity of human nature. The survivors' ability to adapt, to cooperate when possible, and to make decisions under unimaginable stress has become a subject of study in fields ranging from psychology to anthropology. Their story challenges us to consider the limits of morality, the power of hope, and the resilience of the human spirit. As the years passed, the survivors of the Donner Party built new lives. Some prospered in California, contributing to the growth of the state. Others moved away, seeking to escape the shadow of their past. The memory of the mountains, however, remained with them. For some, it was a source of strength. For others, a wound that never fully healed. The Donner Party's story has been retold in countless ways, through books, lectures, and films. Each retelling reflects the questions and concerns of its time. But the core of the story remains unchanged. A group of ordinary people, faced with extraordinary circumstances, forced to confront the limits of endurance and the boundaries of morality. In the end, the Donner Party reminds us that survival is not just a matter of physical strength, but of psychological resilience, ethical decision-making, and the capacity for hope in the face of despair. Their story continues to resonate, challenging us to reflect on our own values and the choices we might make when pushed to the edge. As the last survivors of the Donner Party emerged from the Sierra Nevada in the spring of 1847, the ordeal that had begun with hope and ambition ended in a somber reckoning. The final rescue party, led by William Fallon, found only a handful of survivors at the camps. The rest had perished, their remains a stark testament to the winter's relentless grip. The rescuers buried the dead, gathered the living, and left behind a landscape forever marked by tragedy. The survivors, now safe from the mountains, faced the daunting task of rebuilding their lives. For some, the return to society brought comfort and support. For others, it meant confronting a world that could not fully understand what they had endured. The children, many of them orphaned, were taken in by relatives or adopted by new families. The adults, weakened by months of starvation and trauma, struggled to find work, rebuild relationships, and reclaim a sense of normalcy. Public reaction to the Donner Party's ordeal was immediate and intense. News of the tragedy spread quickly, fueled by newspaper accounts that often emphasized the most sensational aspects of the story. The fact of cannibalism, confirmed by rescuers and survivors alike, shocked the nation. Some responded with sympathy and compassion, recognizing the unimaginable choices forced upon the emigrants. Others reacted with horror, judgment, and even ridicule. In the mid-1800s, the Donner Party became a symbol of both the promise and peril of westward expansion. Their story was retold in sermons, newspapers, and public lectures as a cautionary tale about the dangers of poor planning, the unpredictability of nature, and the limits of human endurance. The survivors themselves became reluctant public figures, their private suffering transformed into a matter of public debate. The long-term cultural and historical legacy of the Donner Party is complex. For decades, the story was recounted as a tale of failure and horror. Yet, as time passed, new interpretations emerged. Historians, psychologists, and anthropologists began to study the Donner Party not only as a tragedy, but as a case study in survival, decision-making, and the resilience of the human spirit. Modern psychology has found in the Donner Party a powerful example of survival under extreme duress. The group's ordeal has been analyzed through the lens of group dynamics, leadership, and the psychological effects of starvation and isolation. Researchers have explored how stress, fear, and deprivation can alter decision-making, erode social bonds, and force individuals to confront moral dilemmas that would be unthinkable under ordinary circumstances. Anthropologists have examined the Donner Party as an example of how culture, belief, and social structure influence survival. The group's reliance on family ties, their efforts to maintain routines and rituals, and their eventual resort to cannibalism all reflect the ways in which human beings adapt to extreme environments. The story has also prompted reflection on the ethics of survival, the boundaries of acceptable behavior, and the ways in which societies remember and judge those who endure the unendurable. In popular culture, the Donner Party has become a symbol of the American frontier's dangers and the costs of ambition. Their story has inspired novels, films, documentaries, and even works of art. Each retelling reflects the concerns and values of its time, but the core questions remain. What does it mean to survive? How do we judge those who make impossible choices? And what can we learn from the past about the limits of human endurance? For the survivors, the legacy of the Donner Party was deeply personal. Many struggled with guilt, grief, and the burden of memory. Some, like Virginia Reed, found solace in faith and family, using their experience to advocate for compassion and understanding. Others, like Louis Kesselberg, lived with the stigma of public suspicion and the pain of being misunderstood. The children who survived grew up with the knowledge that their lives had been shaped by extraordinary circumstances, and many chose to speak openly about their experiences in the hope of finding meaning and healing. The Donner Party's story also influenced the way Americans thought about westward migration. The tragedy prompted changes in how wagon trains were organized, the routes they took, and the preparations they made. The lessons learned from the Donner Party's ordeal helped to prevent similar disasters in the years that followed. even as the myth of the West continued to draw new generations of settlers. Today, the site of the Donner Party's encampment is marked by a state park and memorial. Visitors come to reflect on the story, to honor the memory of those who perished, and to consider the enduring questions raised by the tragedy. The landscape, once a place of suffering and loss, has become a place of remembrance and reflection. In academic circles, the Donner Party remains a subject of ongoing study and debate. Historians continue to examine the decisions that led to the group's entrapment, the dynamics of leadership and conflict, and the ways in which memory and testimony shape our understanding of the past. Psychologists and ethicists use the story to explore the boundaries of human behavior, the nature of trauma, and the capacity for resilience in the face of overwhelming odds. The story of the Donner Party endures because it speaks to universal themes: hope and despair, courage and fear, the bonds of family and community, and the choices we make when everything is at stake. It reminds us that history is not just a record of events, but a reflection of the human experience, its triumphs, its failures, and its enduring mysteries. As we look back on the Donner Party's journey, we are reminded of the fragility of civilization and the strength of the human spirit. Their story challenges us to consider how we might act in similar circumstances and to reflect on the values that guide us in times of crisis. To this day, the story of the Donner Party reminds us how close the edge of civilization truly is, and how far we'll go when survival is all that's left. Thank you for joining us on this journey through one of the most challenging chapters in American history. The story of the Donner Party is not just a tale of tragedy, but a window into the resilience, complexity, and vulnerability of the human spirit. We'd love to hear your thoughts. What lessons do you take from the Donner Party's ordeal? How do you think you might have responded in such extreme circumstances? And what does this story say to you about the boundaries of morality, leadership, and survival? Please share your reflections, questions, or personal insights in the comments or on social media. Let us know where you're listening from and how history continues to echo in your part of the world. If this series moved you, consider sharing it with others who value thoughtful, in-depth explorations of the past. And if you have suggestions for future topics, we welcome your ideas. Thank you for listening and for keeping the memory of the Donner Party and the lessons of their journey alive.